the pack's most worthless wolf. That was Layla, an Omega born to be silent, to serve, and to be invisible. On the night of the Alpha's choosing, she wasn't just overlooked. She was publicly cast out, exiled by Alpha Gideon into the deadliest blizzard of the century. Running for her life, she stumbled into a hidden cave only to find it already occupied. 12 massive near-dead wolves lay in the darkness, their blood staining the stone floor. They were strangers dying, and Layla, the rejected Omega, made a choice that would shatter the world. By morning, the most powerful wolf on the continent would be on his knees, not in defeat, but in devotion. The air in the Shadow Crest Pack's great hall crackled with a tension that was part celebration, part raw, animalistic anxiety. It was the night of the Alpha's choosing, the one night every 5 years when the pack's leader, Alpha Gideon, would select a new mate. The previous Luna had died of a fever, and for a year the pack had been listless aching for the balance only a Luna could provide. Layla watched from her usual place, the shadows by the kitchen entryway, hidden by a tapestry and smelling of bleach and potatoes. She was an Omega. Her very existence was an apology. She was small, with hair the color of river mud, and eyes that were too large and too observant for her station. While other she-wolves spent their days preening and posturing, Layla spent hers, scrubbing floors, mending tunics, and tending to the pack's herb garden, a skill her mother had taught her, before she too had faded into the pack's forgotten history. Layla didn't want Gideon. She didn't delude herself. She knew what he was. From her invisible corner she had seen him arrogant, cruel, with a temper that flared like a forest fire, and a smile that never ever reached his cold, slate-grey eyes. But a tiny, shameful part of her did want to be chosen. Not for the Alpha, but for the title. To be seen. To matter. To finally be warm. The great hall quieted. Alpha Gideon stood on the raised platform, his black and silver fur cloak making him look broader than he was. He prowled the stage, his gaze sweeping over the assembled hopeful she-wolves. "You have all served this pack." His voice boomed a gravelly baritone that made the floorboards vibrate. "But only one has the strength, the breeding, and the loyalty to stand by my side." His eyes scanned the crowd. They passed over Layla, and for a fraction of a second, his lip curled. He saw her. He saw her, and he despised her. Layla shrank further into the shadows, the familiar chill of humiliation creeping into her bones. He wasn't looking for a mate. He was looking for a trophy. His gaze settled on Corinne. Of course it was Corinne. She was the pack beta's daughter, all fiery red hair, sharp curves, and a cruelty that mirrored Gideon's own. She stood at the front, her chin high, a victorious smirk already playing on her lips. "Corinne," Gideon declared. The hall erupted in polite, if unenthusiastic, applause. Corinne glided up the steps, her hips swaying, and took Gideon's hand. He pulled her into a brutal kiss, and the pack howled its approval. Layla began to slip away. Her job here was done. The feast would begin, and she was needed to haul the heavy serving platters. But as she turned, Gideon's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Wait!" The hall fell silent. Every head turned. Layla froze her back to the room. "Our Omega!" Gideon sneered the word Omega, dripping with disgust. "Layla, come here!" A gasp rippled through the crowd. To be called out on choosing night was unprecedented. A cold dread, sharper than the winter wind, settled in Layla's stomach. She turned slowly. Every eye was on her. She felt naked, her threadbare brown tunic a mark of shame. She walked the long, agonizing path from the shadows to the platform. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the worn wooden planks. "Look at me, Omega," Gideon commanded. She forced her head up. He and Corinne were looking down at her, a king and queen judging a peasant. Corinne's eyes were bright with malice. "Did you think, even for a moment, that you had a chance?" Gideon asked, his voice deceptively soft. "No, Alpha," Layla whispered, her voice hoarse. "Good," he laughed, "because your presence, your weakness, it stinks. It taints my pack. You are a weed in a garden of roses." "Gideon," Corinne cooed, placing a hand on his chest. "Don't waste your breath on it. Send it away." "You're right," Gideon said. He looked back at Layla. "You are worthless. You are rejected." It wasn't a proposal she was being denied. It was her very right to exist. "But just being rejected isn't enough, is it?" Gideon mused, enjoying the spectacle. "A weed must be pulled. You are exiled, Layla. Effective immediately." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the first faint howl of the wind outside. Exiled in the middle of the blood winter. It was a death sentence. "You can't," a voice squeaked. It was Brenner, an older Omega, who had sometimes shared her scraps with Layla. Gideon's head snapped toward her. What was that? Brenner shrank but held her ground. The storm Alpha. The elders call it the hunter's moon. No one survives a night like this outside the wards. "Then she had better start running," Gideon snarled. He grabbed Layla's thin arm, his fingers biting into her skin like a vice. He dragged her through the stunned crowd, out of the great hall, and to the massive oak doors of the pack house. He shoved her hard. Layla stumbled and fell, landing on the snow-covered steps. The cold was instantaneous, a physical blow that stole her breath. The wind, no longer a faint howl, was a screaming banshee, ripping at her thin tunic and plastering her hair to her face with ice. "If the moon goddess favors you, you might make it to the forest line before the frost takes your lungs." Gideon mocked from the doorway, the warm golden light of the hall spilling out around him. "But I doubt it." Corinne stood beside him, wrapped in his fur cloak, smiling. The door slammed shut. The heavy thud was followed by the sound of the great iron bar sliding into place. She was locked out. Layla pushed herself to her knees. The snow was already above her ankles, a powdery, lethal white. She looked back at the door at the fortress that had been her prison, and for one night her only home. A howl split the air, but it wasn't from the pack. It was the wind. Run! The single thought cut through her shock. He was right. Her only chance was the forest, the dense pines of the Blackwood. They might offer some meager shelter. She pushed herself to her feet, her body already shivering so hard her teeth rattled. She wrapped her arms around herself and plunged off the steps, leaving the jeering laughter and warm light of the Shadowcrest pack house behind her. She was Layla, the rejected, the exiled, and she was running for her life. The world dissolved into a chaos of white and grey. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked. It came from all directions, at once, armed with needles of ice that bit at any scrap of exposed skin. Layla's cheap leather boots, already cracked and worn, were soaked through in seconds, and her feet became numb, useless blocks of ice. She couldn't see the pack house anymore. She couldn't see the forest. She could only see a few feet in front of her, a swirling vortex of snow that seemed to be actively trying to suck her in and smother her. "Keep moving. Don't stop." Her wolf, a small and timid creature she rarely felt, whimpered in the back of her mind. Cold. So cold. "Give up. Lie down. It will be warm. It will be fast." No, Layla screamed internally. She would not give Gideon the satisfaction. She would not be found in the morning, a frozen statue just yards from his door. She would live if only to spite him. She stumbled over a buried log and fell face first into a snowdrift. The snow was soft like a feather bed. It was quiet here under the surface. The wind was muffled. Her wolf sighed in relief. Yes. Here. Rest. Layla's eyelids felt heavy. Sleep. It would be so easy. A sound snapped her back to reality. A sharp crack of a branch, impossibly loud in the storm, followed by a low guttural growl. It wasn't the wind. Wolves. But not pack wolves. This growl was deeper ragged, laced with a feral hunger. Rogues. Or worse, the wraith claws, the half-mad, fey-blooded wolves that were rumoured to haunt these mountains, driven insane by their mixed blood. They were the pack's ghost stories used to frighten pups. And they were real. Adrenaline cold and sharp flooded Layla's system, burning away the lethargy. She scrambled out of the snowdrift, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could smell them now, under the scent of pine and ice, a rank, metallic odour of unwashed fur and old blood. She ran. She didn't know where she was going. She was off the path. She was deep in the oldest part of the forest, the part the pack elders called the teeth of the mountain. The trees were thicker here, their branches heavy with snow, creating a dark, claustrophobic canopy. Another growl. Closer. She could hear them loping behind her, their heavy paws crunching in the snow. They were toying with her. A game of cat and mouse. An omega was no sport. She was just an appetizer. Layla's lungs burned as if she were inhaling fire. Her legs were lead. She burst through a curtain of snow-laden branches and skidded to a halt. Her feet were on solid stone. The ground in front of her vanished. A cliff. She was at the edge of a cliff. She teetered, catching her balance, and looked down. It was a sheer drop into a black, wind-whipped canyon. Death. She turned. 3 shadows detached themselves from the blizzard. They were enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, with mange-bitten fur and eyes that glowed with a sickly pale green light. Wraithclaws. They weren't a story. The lead wolf, a scarred brute with a missing ear, padded forward, its lips peeling back from yellowed fangs in a grim smile. Layla was trapped, death by falling or death by fang. She looked frantically to her left, to her right. The cliff edge was a semicircle, but there, to her right, half hidden by a snow-caked curtain of ancient ivy, was a shadow, a dark opening in the rock face. A cave. The lead wolf lunged. Layla didn't think. She dove. She scrambled on all fours, tearing the frozen ivy aside, and hurled herself into the blackness. She heard the snap of the wolf's jaws just inches from her ankle. She landed hard on a sloping stone floor, the impact knocking the last of the air from her lungs. She rolled, gasping, and slammed her back against a cold, damp wall. The 3 wraithclaws piled up at the entrance, snarling and snapping their green eyes, peering into the dark. But they hesitated. They paced back and forth, sniffing the air at the cave's mouth, but they would not enter. The lead one let out a frustrated, angry howl and swiped at the ivy, but it backed away. After a moment, Layla heard them growling to each other, and then the sounds faded, swallowed by the storm. They were gone. Why wouldn't they follow? What was in this cave that was so terrifying? Even a wraithclaw wouldn't dare enter Layla's heart, was beating so fast she thought it might burst. She lay in the pitch black, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The air in here was different. It was still, but it was not empty. It smelled of iron. It smelled of ozone. And it smelled overwhelmingly of blood. She was not alone. She fumbled in the small pouch she always wore on her belt. Her hands, numb and shaking, found what she was looking for. A small flint, a piece of steel, and a small wax-covered bundle of dried tinder. She was always prepared. The Omega always had to be ready to make a fire for her betters. Her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries, but she finally struck a spark. The tuinda caught, and a tiny flickering flame illuminated her hand. She held it up, and she screamed. The flame illuminated a scene from a nightmare. The cave was massive, a vast, dark cathedral of stone, and it was full of wolves. They were everywhere, sprawled on the floor, slumped against the walls, lying in tangled heaps. But they weren't like the wraithclaws. They were magnificent. Their fur black-grey and deep auburn was thick and rich, even matted with snow and blood. And they were massive, larger than Gideon, larger than any wolf she had ever dreamed of. These were not wolves. These were dire wolves, monsters of legend. There was 1, 2, she counted. 12. 12 wolves, and not a single one of them was moving. A few were in their human forms, half-shifted, their bodies bare and covered in wounds, not scratches. These were wounds. Deep black-rimmed gashes that looked less like they were made by claws and more like they were made by poisoned steel. Layla's tiny flame flickered, casting huge dancing shadows. She crept closer to the nearest form, a man with hair as dark as a raven's wing slumped against a boulder. His chest was rising and falling, but it was a shallow, hitching breath. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. He was burning with fever. She was in a cave, hidden from a blizzard, surrounded by 12 dying, unknown, and immensely powerful shifters. The wraithclaws hadn't been afraid of her. They had been afraid of these. Her little flame sputtered and died, plunging her back into the terrifying, blood-scented dark. The darkness was absolute, but the sounds were terrifyingly clear. A low, wet gurgle from the back of the cave, a pained, whistling breath from the man near her, the steady, slow drip, drip, drip of melting ice, or blood. Layla's first instinct was to run, to flee back into the storm, to take her chances with the wraithclaws. Whatever was in this cave, it was the center of a violence she couldn't comprehend. The wraithclaws were afraid of this place for a reason. But as she scrambled backward, her hand brushed against the arm of the man she had touched. His skin was fire. The fever was raging. He's dying. Her mother's voice, soft as a spring breeze, echoed in her memory. We are Omegas, Layla. We are not strong like the Alphas or fast like the Betas. We are the heart. We see the pain and we heal it. That is our strength. Never let them tell you it is a weakness. Gideon had called her weak. Corinne had called her worthless. She looked at her hand, barely visible in the gloom. She had nothing. She had no pack, no home, no future. She was an exile, a ghost. But I am not worthless. A new, unfamiliar resolve hardened inside her. It was a cold, quiet anger. She would not let these men, these wolves, die. Not if she could help it. To save them or to die trying. It was a better death than freezing alone in a snowdrift. I am not weak, she whispered to the darkness. Action. She needed action. She fumbled for her tinderbox again. This time her hands were steady. She struck a spark and lit the small bundle. She looked around, spotting a pile of dry, long-dead branches in a corner, likely dragged in by some animal. A blessing. Within minutes, she had a small, crackling fire. It was pitiful against the vast, cold dark of the cave, but it was a start. The flickering light gave her a better look at the carnage. It was a war zone. The 12 wolves or men they were in various states of shift were a unit. They were dressed or had been in remnants of black functional gear now torn to shreds. The sigil on a piece of a leather pauldron caught her eye, a crimson wolf's head snarling. She had never seen it before. She turned her attention to the man nearest her, the one with the raven-dark hair. He was powerfully built, a tapestry of muscle and old scars. His face was noble even in its feverish grimace, with a strong jaw and a proud, straight nose. A new wound, a vicious gash across his ribs, was seeping a black, foul-smelling poison. Poison. That's why they were so weak. This wasn't a lost fight. It was an ambush, an assassination. Layla tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her own tunic. It was all she had. She ran to the cave mouth, gathering handfuls of the purest snow. She used it to clean the wound. The man groaned a deep rumbling sound that vibrated in her bones, but he didn't wake. "I know," she murmured, her voice soft. "I'm sorry. But this will help." She looked at the poison. It was dark, viscous, fey-made. Her stomach turned. But she knew this. Her mother had taught her. The mountain provides the bane and the antidote, child. You just have to know where to look. She peered back out the cave entrance. The ivy the wraith claws had clawed at. It wasn't just ivy. Mixed in with it, identifiable even in the snow, was a thin, silvery vine with thorns. Moonthorn, a rare, dangerous plant, deadly to mortals. But for fey poison, it was the only antidote. She grabbed her flint knife. "I'll be right back," she promised the unconscious man. She crawled to the cave's entrance. The wind was still a physical force, but her fire-stoked resolve was a shield. She hacked at the frozen vines, her numb fingers working clumsily. She gathered an armful of the moonthorn, plus a handful of stubborn, frozen pine needles. Back at the fire, she used a flat stone as a mortar and her knife as a pestle. She crushed the pine needles, the moonthorn, and a bit of snow into a thick, fragrant paste. The smell was sharp and clean. She returned to the dark-haired man. "This is going to hurt," she warned his sleeping form. She packed the green and white paste into the black, festering wound. The effect was instantaneous. The man roared. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a mountain cracking in two. He convulsed his back, arching off the floor. His eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a man. They were the molten gold eyes of a dominant, furious alpha. They locked on her, and Layla felt her own weak wolf collapse in submission. This was power. Before she could react, another man, this one with sandy hair and a broken arm, launched himself from the shadows. He had been pretending to be unconscious. He slammed into her, pinning her to the ground, his forearm across her throat. "Who are you?" He snarled, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Wraithclaw witch. What did you do to him?" Layla clawed at his arm, her vision spotting. Helping," she choked out. "Kian, enough." The single word cut through the cave. It wasn't a shout, but a command that demanded to be obeyed. The man on top of her, Kian, froze. He looked over his shoulder. The dark-haired alpha was sitting up. The gold in his eyes was fading, replaced by a sharp, intelligent, and incredibly piercing blue. The fever was gone. The blackness was receding from his wound. He was weak, breathing heavily, but he was lucid. "I said," the alpha repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Enough. Get off of her." Kian scrambled off Layla as if he'd been burned. Layla gasped for air, rubbing her bruised throat. The alpha's gaze fell on her. He studied her. He saw her threadbare tunic, her numb blue fingers, the herb pouch at her belt. He looked at the fire she had built. He looked at the wound on his side, now clean and packed with the moonthorn paste. "You healed me," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You were poisoned," Layla said, her voice shaking but her gaze defiant. She would not be cowed, not anymore. "Fey blood poison, the moonthorn. It's the only antidote." Kian stared at her dumbfounded. "You know of fey poison." "I know herbs," Layla said, simply getting to her feet and brushing snow from her tunic. The alpha watched her, his expression unreadable. He looked around the cave at his other 11 men, all groaning, stirring now that the immediate threat was gone. "My name is Kian," the sandy-haired man said, his tone no longer hostile, but wary and full of a new grudging respect. We owe you a debt." "I don't want a debt," Layla said, her shoulders slumping. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted. I couldn't let you die." The Alpha locked eyes with her. He saw the bruise on her throat from Kian's arm. He saw the deeper, older bruises in her soul. "Who are you, girl?" he asked, his voice low and compelling. What pack would leave an Omega with a healer's knowledge to die in a blizzard? "The Shadow Crest pack," Layla said, her voice bitter. "And my Alpha Gideon exiled me. He cast me out just hours ago." A dangerous stillness fell over the Alpha. He shared a look with Kian. "Gideon." The Alpha repeated the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Of Shadowcrest." "Yes," Layla said, confused. "Do you know him?" Before the Alpha could answer, a new sound came from the cave's entrance. The wind had died down slightly, and in the lull, Layla heard it. Men's voices, shouting, and the thud of heavy paws in the snow. "I knew I smelled a rat," a voice boomed, a voice that made Layla's blood run colder than the blizzard. It was Gideon. He had tracked her. The cave, which had moments before felt like a sanctuary, instantly became a trap. "They're here!" Kian hissed, grabbing a wicked-looking knife from his boot. He tried to stand, but his legs, weak from the poison, buckled. He cursed, his face pale with fury and helplessness. The other 10 wolves were stirring, pushing themselves up. They were a mess of broken bones, poisoned wounds, and sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness. One, a massive man with a red beard, Layla saw his name, Maddox tattooed on his forearm, staggered to his feet and formed a protective wall in front of the dark-haired, seated Alpha. "Your Majesty, stay down." Maddox growled, his voice a low rumble. Your Majesty, Layla's mind reeled. She didn't have time to process the word. "In the back, all of you," the dark-haired Alpha commanded. He wasn't asking. He was the man she had healed. He pointed a finger not at Layla, but at his own men. "Get back in the shadows. Now." "But Riker," Kian started. "That is an order," Kian, the Alpha Riker, snapped. His voice, though weakened, was a physical force. It was the voice of a man who had never been disobeyed. The Royal Guard for Layla now understood. That's what they must be, melted back into the darkness of the massive cave. They were wounded, but they were predators, and they knew how to hide. Riker stayed where he was, near the fire, his back against the cave wall. He looked at Layla. The firelight flickered in his intense blue eyes. "And you," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Stay by the fire. Don't speak. Don't move. Let me handle this." Layla's heart hammered. "He's my Alpha. He won't listen." "He is not your Alpha." Riker said the words a final, steel-hard pronouncement. "He is just a male. Now do as I say." Layla nodded, her throat tight. She retreated to the fire, her hands clutched so tightly her nails were biting into her palms. The entrance of the cave darkened. 2 figures stepped inside, silhouetted against the swirling grey light of the dawn. Alpha Gideon entered first, his silver and black cloak dusted with snow. He looked magnificent, powerful, and utterly terrifying. Behind him, like a pale shadow, was Corinne, her red hair a vivid splash of color. She was wrapped in a thick fur, her lips twisted in a sneer of disgust. "Well, well!" Gideon boomed, his voice echoing off the stone. The little rat found a hole to die in. He strode in, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw the fire. He saw Layla huddled beside it, looking small and pathetic. And then he saw Riker. Gideon stopped. He hadn't expected this. He saw a man, a large man, true, but a wounded one. He was leaning against the wall, his clothes in tatters, his black hair matted with sweat, and was that a poultice? Gideon's eyes narrowed. He sniffed the air. He smelled the blood, the poison, and something else. A core of power, deep and unfamiliar. But it was dampened. The man was clearly weak. "Who is this?" Gideon demanded, gesturing at Riker with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Another rogue. Did you find a wounded mate to cry to Layla?" Corinne laughed, a high tinkling sound that made Layla's skin crawl. "It looks half dead, Gideon, just like her. Maybe they can die together. How romantic." Layla flinched, but Riker's gaze was fixed on Gideon. It was a gaze of pure predatory calculation. He was watching a mouse that didn't know the hawk was circling. "This cave is under the protection of the Shadow Crest Pack," Gideon announced, puffing out his chest. "I am Alpha Gideon. Whatever stray you are, you will answer to me. Or this Omega will pay for harboring you." Riker remained silent. He simply watched. His stillness was more unnerving than any threat. "What has the frost got your tongue?" Gideon sneered. He took a heavy, arrogant step toward the fire. "I am speaking to you, rogue." "And I?" Riker's voice was quiet, but it filled the cave. "Am listening." Gideon paused. The man's voice. It held no fear, no deference, only a cold, abyssal calm. "He's mine, Gideon," Layla said, her voice small but clear. Gideon, Riker, and even Corinne looked at her in surprise. "What did you say?" Gideon's eyes flashed with anger. Layla got to her knees. She was terrified, but the sight of Gideon's arrogance, his stupidity in the face of this king, gave her a strange, wild courage. "I found him," she said, her voice stronger. "He and his men. They were wounded. I am a healer. I am helping them. You can't have them." Gideon stared at her, as if she had grown a second head. Then he threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "You a healer. You're a floor scrubber, Omega. And you can't let me. You are giving me orders." He stalked toward her. "I am going to teach you the meaning of your place." He raised his hand, his claws partially extended to backhand her. "No," Layla cried, shrinking back. But the blow never landed. In a blur of motion, so fast Layla could barely track it, Riker had moved. He was no longer leaning against the wall. He was standing between Layla and Gideon. He hadn't working with the wound, the poison, and the exhaustion. Riker was still faster than a healthy Alpha. He had Gideon's wrist in a grip that was visibly audibly crushing bone. Crunch. Gideon screamed. It was a high, thin, unbelieving sound. He stared in horror as his hand bent at an impossible angle. "You broke my arm!" He shrieked, his Alpha pride shattering. "It was a clumsy swing." Riker said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. He released the arm and Gideon staggered back, clutching his ruined wrist, his face a mask of white, shocked agony. Corinne screamed. "Gideon, he attacked you. Kill him." "Silence," Riker said without even looking at her. The word was not a request. The power in it, the pure Alpha command, slammed into Corinne like a physical blow. She clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She literally could not speak. Gideon was breathing heavily, his one good hand clutching his arm. The dynamic in the cave had shifted, violently and irrevocably. "You? Who? What are you?" Gideon stammered, his arrogance evaporating, replaced by a dawning sickly fear. He was looking at Riker properly now. He was seeing the breadth of his shoulders, the innate, coiled power. He was smelling the air, and beneath the blood and the herbs he was finally smelling the truth. It was a scent he only knew from legend. The scent of the first wolf. The bloodline of the king. He asked me my name. Riker said, his voice conversational, though it echoed with a chilling power. He took one step toward Gideon. Gideon took one step back. He asked me who I was. Riker took another step. He laid his hands. Riker's voice dropped to a growl that shook dust from the ceiling, on my healer. From the shadows, 12 pairs of golden eyes ignited, glowing in the dark like fallen stars. The royal guard stepped forward, wounded but ready to kill. Gideon's world collapsed. He looked at the 12 elite legendary warriors. He looked at the man who had healed them. And he looked at the man who stood before him, his blue eyes now burning with a cold, righteous fury. Gideon's knees gave out. He fell into the snow and mud at the cave's entrance. No, Gideon whispered, his voice trembling. It can't be. You're supposed to be in the capital. Riker stopped looming over the pathetic kneeling Alpha. I am Riker Alpha, king of all territories, he declared, his voice a judgment. And you, Alpha Gideon, have just raised your hand to my Luna. Cho'ah froze. The royal guard froze. And in the silence of the cave, Layla's heart stopped. What? The silence in the cave was so profound, Layla could hear the hiss of a single snowflake melting on the fire. My Luna. The words hung in the air, heavier and more powerful than any Alpha command. Gideon, kneeling in the slush, stared up at Riker with a face of pure abject terror. His mind, which had been so slow to catch up, was now racing, connecting the dots in a horrifying tapestry. The ambush, the poison, the legends of the king's royal guard, the king himself here in his territory wounded. And he, Gideon, had just, Your Majesty, Gideon stammered, bowing his head so low his forehead touched the stone floor. He was prostrating himself. A misunderstanding. A terrible... I didn't know. How could I know? Riker watched him, his expression one of cold contempt. You didn't know. That is the only reason your head is still attached to your shoulders. You didn't know that this was the Alpha King you were threatening. He paced his movements, stiff from his healing wound, but still possessing a lethal grace. But you did know she was an Omega. He continued, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You did know she was a member of your pack under your protection. You did know you were exiling her to die in a blizzard. You did know you were striking her. He stopped in front of Layla. He looked down at her. She was still on her knees by the fire, her eyes wide, her mind spinning. He called you worthless, Riker said to her, his voice softer, but loud enough for all to hear. He exiled you. She is. Corinne suddenly shrieked. The force of Riker's command had faded, and her own panic and malice had overwhelmed it. She's nothing. She's a nobody. You can't just call her Luna. That's not how it works. She hasn't been chosen. There was no ritual. She's a filthy Omega. Kian took one step toward her, a snarl on his face, but Riker raised a hand. Stop! Kian stopped. Riker turned his head very slowly to look at Corinne. She was still standing near the entrance, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of ugly jealousy. You, Riker said, are the Beta's daughter, the one he chose. Yes, Corinne said, mistaking his attention for interest. She tried to smooth her hair to look appealing. I am Corinne. I am his chosen Luna. You are an idiot, Riker stated flatly. The insult delivered with such dispassionate calm was more brutal than any shout. Corinne's face crumpled. You think the title of Luna is about a ritual, about bloodlines and preening, Riker scoffed. You think it's about being chosen by a weak, posturing bully. He gestured to the cave to his men. My royal guard, the 12 strongest Alphas in my kingdom, were ambushed. We were struck by fey-poisoned arrows, courtesy of the Wraith Claws. At the mention of the wraith claws, Gideon, still on the floor, let out a choked sound. Riker's eyes snapped back to him. Ah, so you do know. You know they hunt in your woods, and you've done nothing. Interesting. He turned his focus back to the cave. We fought them off, but the poison was effective. We made it to this cave, our emergency sanctuary, to die. We were burning with a fever that would have cooked our brains by morning. He looked at Layla, his gaze softening with a raw, profound emotion that made her heart ache. And then she came. An Omega, cast out, freezing hunted. She had every reason to run, every reason to let us die. We were strangers, and one of my own men, he shot a brief, hard look at Kian, who winced, attacked her. And what did she do? Riker's voice was a powerful broadcast meant to educate, to judge. She built a fire. She braved the storm again to gather moonthorn and herb your beta daughter here probably thinks is a weed. She knew the antidote to a poison that has baffled my own royal healers. She, with her worthless Omega hands, single-handedly saved the lives of the entire royal guard. And the king? He walked over and knelt in front of Layla, ignoring Gideon, ignoring Corinne, ignoring his own men. He was on her level. He looked her right in the eyes. His were no longer cold, but burning with a blue fire. And then, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, just for her. After all that, when your Alpha came to harm her, she with no strength, no one to back her. She tried to stand between him and me. He so gently touched the bruise on her throat where Kian had grabbed her. Layla shivered, but not from cold. That, Riker said, his voice ringing with conviction, is not an Omega. That is not weakness, that is a queen. He stood turning to face the pathetic remnants of the Shadow Crest leadership. Gideon. Riker said, all softness gone. You are stripped of your title. You are no longer Alpha. No, please. Your Majesty, I beg you. Gideon groveled, trying to crawl forward. You have failed your pack. You have failed your goddess. And you have committed high treason. Treason, Gideon squeaked. The wraith claws. Riker said they knew where we would be. They knew our route. An ambush like that. It required information from inside a pack, from an Alpha who perhaps was getting a share of their stolen goods. An Alpha who let them hunt in his territory as long as they stayed away from the pack house. Gideon's face went from terrified to ghostly white. He was caught. Kian, Maddox, detain him, Riker ordered. He will be taken back to the capital for public trial. He will wish for the death he so easily handed out to this Omega. The two guards, despite their injuries, surged forward and hauled Gideon to his feet. He did not fight. He was a broken, defeated wolf. And her Kian pointed at Corinne, who was shaking, tears of rage and terror streaming down her face. She is an accessory to her Alpha's cruelty, Riker said. But her true crime is ignorance. She will be taken too. She will serve not as a Luna, but in the royal kitchens. She will scrub floors and learn what true work is. Perhaps in a few years, she will learn humility. If not, she will just be a very clean fool. Corinne let out a despairing wail as Maddox grabbed her arm and dragged her unceremoniously next to Gideon. The cave was quiet again, the drama over. The storm outside had begun to quiet, and the first pale grey light of morning was filtering in. Riker stood in the center of the cave, the undisputed master of it all. He was wounded, his clothes were ruined, but he had never looked more powerful. And then he turned to Layla. She was the only one left. The guards, the prisoners, all waited. Riker walked to her. He stood before her for a long, silent moment, just looking. It was the first time in her life Layla felt she was truly seen. He saw the healer, the outcast, the survivor. He saw the strength she never knew she had. And then, to the absolute stunned shock of every person in the cave, Alpha King Riker, the most powerful man on the continent, went down on one knee. He sank onto the stone floor, putting himself below her. He took her small, chapped, herb-stained hand in his large, warm, calloused one. "Layla of no pack," he said, his voice formal, yet trembling with emotion. "You saved my life. You saved my men. You have the courage of an Alpha, the wisdom of an Elder, and the heart of a true Luna. The moon goddess did not reject you. She was hiding you. For me." He looked up, his blue eyes locking with hers. "I am asking not as a king commanding, but as a wolf, as a man. Will you do me the profound honor of being my partner? Will you stand by my side not as a trophy, but as my equal? Will you be my Luna, Layla's door?" Layla's world, which had been turned upside down, shattered and remade in the span of 8 hours, tilted on its axis one last time. An Alpha King was kneeling at her feet. Her mind was blank. All she could do was stare at the top of his dark raven-black hair. She saw the streak of mud and blood near his temple. She had the absurd, overwhelming urge to reach out and clean it. "He's asking you a question," her own voice whispered in her head. I, she stammered. Her throat was dry. Riker didn't rush her. He simply waited, his gaze unwavering, his hand holding hers with a gentle warmth that was seeping into her frozen limbs, chasing away a chill that was bone-deep and years old. She looked past him. Kian and Maddox stood grim-faced, holding Gideon and Corinne, who were both watching the scene with expressions of absolute horrified disbelief. The other 10 members of the Royal Guard, wounded and weary, were also watching. But they weren't horrified. They were hopeful. Their expressions were soft, respectful. They were looking at her as if she held the answer to a prayer. She, Layla, the Omega, the floor scrubber, the reject. She looked back at Riker. She saw the man she had healed. She saw the warrior who had protected her. She saw the king who had passed judgment. But underneath all of that, she saw something else. She saw a flicker of vulnerability. He was the king, yes, but he was also a man, kneeling on a cold stone floor, asking. He wasn't just declaring her his Luna, as he had in anger to Gideon. He was asking her to be. He was giving her the one thing no one, especially not Gideon, ever had. A choice. "Why me?" she whispered so low only he could hear. "You are the king. You could have anyone. Any high-born Alpha's daughter. Why, this," she gestured to herself, to her ragged, dirty tunic. "Because," Riker said, his voice just as low, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "those high-born daughters would have run. They would have screamed. They would have fainted at the sight of the blood. You," he said, and his voice was thick with admiration, "saw 12 dying wolves, and your first thought was to save them. You saw poison, and you knew the cure. You saw an enemy, and you stood your ground. I don't want a high-born daughter, Layla. I want a partner. I want you." A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and rolled down her dirt-stained cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. It was the sound of the dam of a lifetime of pain and loneliness finally breaking. She took a shaky breath. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she let her own tiny, timid wolf step forward, and her wolf didn't cower. It looked at the massive royal wolf before her, and it recognized him. Mate. The word was a chime, a bell, a resounding truth in her soul. The moon goddess hadn't been hiding her. She had been saving her. Layla opened her eyes. She pulled her hand from his grasp, only to place both of her hands on either side of his face. His skin was rough with stubble. His cheek was cold. She, the Omega, was cupping the face of the Alpha King. "Yes," she said. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear and steady. It echoed in the cave a counterpoint to his own command. "Yes, I will." A collective relieved sigh went through the royal guard. Riker's own eyes closed for a fraction of a second, his entire body slumping in relief. He had been terrified she would say no. He opened his eyes, and a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was the first true smile Layla had ever seen on a man, and it transformed his harsh, noble features into something breathtakingly handsome. It was a smile that reached his eyes, turning them from a piercing blue to the color of a warm summer sky. "Thank you," he breathed. He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. He didn't pull her into a kiss. He didn't throw her over his shoulder. He simply kept her hand in his and turned to face the room standing beside her as her equal. "My Luna," he said, and the words were no longer a weapon, but a statement of fact. The 12 members of the Royal Guard wounded, and all immediately dropped to one knee. "Luna," they roared their voices as one. The force of their approval, their acceptance, slammed into Layla, and she straightened her spine. She was no longer Layla the Omega. She was Layla Luna of the Royal Pack. "Gideon," Riker's voice was ice once more. "You will be the first to kneel. You will address your new Luna, the one you exiled." Gideon, held between Kian and Maddox, was trembling with a fury so profound it choked him. To be so humiliated. "Kneel!" Kian roared, kicking the back of Gideon's knees. Gideon collapsed onto the stone. He refused to look at her. I, look at her!" Riker commanded. Slowly, his eyes burning with a hatred that was almost impressive, Gideon raised his head. He looked at Layla. He saw her standing tall, her hand in the king's, her face stained with tears and dirt, but her eyes were no longer the downcast, timid eyes of an Omega. They were the clear, steady eyes of a Luna. "My Luna," he spat the words like poison on his tongue. "A good start," Riker said coolly. "Take them. Get them to the surface. Send a signal to the Royal Airship. I want them in a cell before noon." Kian and Maddox nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." They dragged Gideon and the weeping Corinne out of the cave entrance into the new bright light of the morning. The storm had passed. Layla and Riker were left with the 10 other guards who were now struggling to their feet, bowing respectfully. "Go," Riker told them. "Secure the perimeter. Find our packs, and thank you for your service." The men nodded one by one and filed out each one, pausing to give Layla a nod of deep, profound respect. Finally, they were alone. It was just Layla and Riker in the massive, silent cave. The fire was burning low, and the bright morning sun was streaming in through the entrance, cutting a brilliant golden swath through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Layla looked at her hand, still held in his. It was so small. I don't know how to be a Luna," she said quietly, the first doubt creeping in. "I don't know how to be a queen." Riker turned to her. He used his free hand to finally brush the smudge of blood and dirt from her cheek, his touch impossibly gentle. "You don't have to know," he said, his voice low and intimate. "You just have to be. You were a Luna the moment you decided to build that fire. You were a queen the moment you stood up to Gideon." He smiled. "The rest, it's just learning. And I'll be with you. We'll learn together." He squeezed her hand. "The storm is over, Layla. It's time to go home." "Home?" she asked. "My home. Our home. The Royal Pack." He led her toward the cave entrance, toward the light. She took a step and then paused, looking back at the dark, bloody cave that had been her prison, her sanctuary, and her crucible. She would never forget this place. She turned her back on the darkness, and with her hand held firmly in the king's, Layla stepped out into the morning. The light was blinding. Layla stepped from the cave, and the post-blizzard sun reflecting on the fresh snow was a physical shock. The sky was a sharp, cloudless blue. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It is." Riker agreed, his eyes on her as she breathed in her first gulp of clean, cold air. They stood on a high ledge overlooking a vast canyon. Below them the royal guard moved with purpose. Kian fired a crimson flare, while Maddox secured the hands of a slumped, defeated Gideon and Corinne. At their emergence, the guard bowed their heads. Gideon, seeing the respect she commanded, let out a final impotent growl. Layla flinched, an echo of old fear. Riker immediately stepped in front of her, shielding her. His power rolled off him, a crushing, silent weight. Gideon choked his head, forced to bow. "You will never!" Riker's voice cut through the still air. "Be a threat to her again. Your pack is dissolved. Your lands are forfeit. You are nothing." He turned his back on the broken mail, the ultimate dismissal. He then turned to Layla and gently swept her off her feet. She gasped. "Riker, your wound." "It is nothing," he said, holding her close as if she weighed less than air. "You are everything, and my name is not my title. You may call me Riker, but I would prefer you call me your mate." Layla's heart, which she thought was too broken to ever heal, felt full. She rested her head on his broad chest, listening to the steady, strong beat. "Riker," she whispered. "My mate." It felt right. He carried her down the sunlit path, leaving the cave and the darkness behind for good. 1 month later, Layla stood in the Queen's Garden, a massive, sun-drenched greenhouse at the heart of the royal pack. She wore an elegant deep green gown, her hair braided with silver clips, and she was teaching a group of young healers. "The books will call it poison," Layla explained, holding up a sprig of moonthorn. "But the world is tended by omegas. We see the things alphas overlook. The vine is the cure." "Luna, how did you learn this?" one asked. Before Layla could answer, a warm presence settled behind her. "I came to steal my mate," Riker's voice rumbled. The healers bowed. "As you were," he smiled, kissing Layla's hair. "Though I see she is busy teaching treason, telling omegas to ignore books written by alphas a revolution." Layla laughed, swatting his arm. "I am teaching healing." Her eyes drifted. At the far end of the garden, a lone figure scrubbed pots. Corinne. Her red hair was tied in a kerchief, her shoulders hunched. "She's learning," Riker said quietly. "She reminds me of what I was," Layla whispered. "No," Riker said, turning her to face him, his gaze firm and warm. "She is what you feared you were. You were never her. You were always a queen, just one without a crown." He smiled, his blue eyes dancing. "Now are you done with your revolution? For the day your king has a very private request for his Luna." Layla laughed, a sound that was now bright and free. "Lead the way, my king," she said, taking his hand. And so the rejected stone became the cornerstone of a new kingdom. Layla the Omega, no one saw, became the Luna everyone looked up to, proving that true strength isn't about the power you're born with, but the courage you show when you have nothing. Her heart, once exiled to the cold, now ruled with a warmth that healed an entire land. What did you think of Layla's incredible journey from outcast to queen? Was Gideon's fate deserved? If you loved this story of justice, destiny, and the power of a kind heart, please show your support. Hit that like button. It truly helps the channel. Share this video with someone else who needs a story of hope, and most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another epic tale. We have so many more stories to tell, and we can't wait to share them with you. Thanks for listening.